It was late. Just another night in the bustling city. Horns blared, headlights flashed, and people scurried along the sidewalks like they were racing the clock. For Mike, it was just another shift. Or so he thought. He was about to call it a night when he spotted her. A girl standing alone on the corner of Elm and Fifth. She wasn't like most people he picked up. Her white cane tapped the pavement in sharp, deliberate motions, and her face tilted slightly upward, as if she were trying to hear the world better. She wore sunglasses, though the sun had long disappeared, and her small frame seemed out of place in the chaos around her. Mike hesitated. Should he stop? His shift was almost over, and the thought of heading home was tempting. But something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way she stood, so still yet so certain, or maybe it was the faint vulnerability wrapped in her confidence. Before he could overthink it, he pulled up to the curb. The girl opened the door with practiced ease, sliding in like she'd done this 100 times before. "Thank you for stopping," she said quietly, but her voice carried a strength that caught Mike off guard. Not many drivers bother. Mike felt a pang of guilt. Had she been standing there long? "Well," he said, forcing a light chuckle, "I'm not like most drivers. Where to?" She rattled off an address, one that made Mike pause for just a second. It was on the other side of town, far from the bright lights and busy streets. "All right," he said, shifting into gear. "Let's get you there." The drive started in silence, but Mike couldn't help glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She sat straight, her white cane resting across her lap, her hands lightly gripping it. Something about her felt different. Finally, he broke the quiet. "What's your name?" "Amara," she said simply, then added, "And yours?" "Mike," he replied. "So, Amara, what's got you out so late?" He tried to sound casual, but his curiosity leaked into the question. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of her cane. "I'm meeting someone," she said finally. "It's important." Mike nodded. "All right," he said, letting her keep her mystery. Not everyone liked to share their life story, and he respected that. But still, something felt heavy in the air, like she was holding on to more than just her destination. As they drove deeper into the city, the streets grew quieter. The hum of the car filled the space between them until Amara's voice broke through. "Do you believe in second chances, Mike?" The question hit him out of nowhere. He glanced back at her, confused. "Second chances?" he repeated. I guess it depends." "Why do you ask?" Amara's fingers tightened around her cane. "Because I need one," she said, her voice trembling just enough to make Mike's chest tighten. He swallowed hard, his grip on the wheel firming. A second chance for what? She took a shaky breath, her shoulders rising and falling as if the weight of her words was too much. "To fix something I broke," she whispered. Mike's mind spun. Her words carried a heaviness that pressed against him, but he couldn't place why. He thought about asking more, but the way she stared out the window, like she was already lost in her own thoughts, kept him quiet. Minutes passed, each one dragging heavier than the last, until finally, they arrived at her destination. It was a dimly lit building on a street Mike rarely ventured down. He parked the car, his hand resting on the gear shift as he turned to face her. "All right, we're here," he said softly. But before she could step out, Amara leaned forward. "Wait," she said, her voice urgent. "Mike, there's something I need to tell you." The intensity in her tone made him freeze. "What is it?" he asked, his heart thudding in his chest. She reached up, pulling off her sunglasses to reveal eyes that were cloudy but alive with emotion. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said, her words laced with something between hope and fear. Mike frowned, his mind scrambling for recognition. "Should I?" Amara nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "Years ago, you did something that saved my life. You might not even know it, but you did, and I've been waiting all this time to tell you." His pulse quickened. "Saved your life?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "How?" Her hands gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles white. "What happened that night? It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice breaking. "But it changed everything for me, and I've been carrying it with me ever since." The air in the car felt electric, charged with something Mike couldn't explain. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, but his throat felt dry. "Amara," he said finally, "what are you talking about?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she shook her head. "I don't even know if I can say it," she admitted, her voice cracking. But I need you to know, I've been trying to forgive myself for years, and now I just need to know if you can forgive me too. Mike stared at her, his mind racing. Forgive her? For what? His chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. Whatever she was about to say, it felt like it was going to change everything. Before he could respond, Amara reached for the door, her trembling fingers barely managing to open it. I'll explain, she said, stepping out into the cold night air. But not yet. And with that, she was gone, leaving Mike sitting there, his world suddenly tilted off its axis. Mike sat there, staring at the spot where Amara had disappeared into the shadows. The street was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He couldn't move. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but his mind was racing, replaying her words over and over. What happened that night? It wasn't your fault. What night? What was she talking about? Mike prided himself on remembering faces and stories. Over the years, countless people had stepped into his cab, sharing bits of their lives, some funny, some tragic, some downright unbelievable. But Amara? She didn't ring a bell, no matter how hard he tried to recall. Yet her words carried a weight, a familiarity he couldn't explain. After a few minutes, he shook himself out of his daze and glanced at the clock on the dashboard. His shift was officially over, but the thought of going home felt impossible. How could he sleep when his mind was consumed by questions? He turned off the meter and leaned back in his seat, staring at the dimly lit building she had entered. The address she'd given wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't the worst either. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear. Quiet, nondescript, and easy to overlook. For a moment, he considered going after her. Maybe he could ask her more, get some clarity. But a voice in the back of his mind stopped him. What if she doesn't want to be found? What if the truth is something you don't want to hear? Instead, he pulled out a cigarette, even though he hadn't smoked in years, and let it dangle between his fingers without lighting it. The habit, though long buried, crept back like an old friend when his nerves were shot. He sat there, lost in thought, until the sound of laughter broke through the stillness. Two teenagers on skateboards zoomed past, jolting him out of his trance. He exhaled sharply and started the car, deciding to drive aimlessly for a while to clear his head. The streets blurred past as his thoughts churned. Who was Amara? How had their paths crossed before? And what could she possibly mean by saving her life? He couldn't shake the look in her eyes when she spoke, cloudy yet piercing, filled with something he couldn't quite name. The night felt endless, and as he drove, memories began surfacing. Little fragments of his past, faces, moments, regrets. He thought about the nights when his cab had been more than just a ride, when he'd become a witness to someone's pain or joy. And then it hit him. There was one night, years ago, that had haunted him. A rainy night, the kind that soaks you to the bone and makes the city feel colder than it really is. He'd picked up a young woman in distress, her face pale, her hands trembling. She was desperate to get away from something, or someone. Mike's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he tried to piece together the memory. He hadn't thought about that ride in years. The girl had been scared, barely able to speak, but he'd done what he could to help her. He'd driven fast, dropped her off at a location she'd whispered through her tears, and watched as she disappeared into the night. Could that girl have been Amara? It didn't make sense. That woman had been older, or so he thought. But details from that night were hazy, blurred by time and the sheer intensity of it all. The more he tried to recall, the more his chest tightened. He had no way of knowing if the two were connected, but the unease gnawed at him. What if Amara's story was tied to something he'd buried? What if the truth, whatever it was, had been right there all along? The car slowed to a stop at a red light, and Mike stared at the reflection of the traffic signal on the wet pavement. The city was alive in its own quiet way, but for Mike, it felt like the world had stopped. Amara's words echoed in his mind, louder now, sharper. If you can forgive me, maybe I can forgive myself. What could she possibly need his forgiveness for? And why did her pain feel so personal, as if it had somehow wrapped itself around him too? When the light turned green, Mike didn't move. He sat there, frozen in place until a horn blared behind him, snapping him back to reality. He muttered an apology under his breath and hit the gas, but his thoughts remained tangled in the mystery of Amara. As he drove toward home, his resolve hardened. He couldn't just let this go. Whatever the connection was, whatever truth she was carrying, he had to know. Not just for her sake, but for his own. Because deep down, he felt it too. The weight of something unfinished, something waiting to be uncovered. Mike pulled into his driveway, but instead of heading inside, he sat in the car, staring at the dashboard. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked tired, older than he remembered. With a deep breath, he grabbed his phone and scrolled to the address she'd given him earlier. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, he'd find out. The next morning, Mike couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in his chest. He barely slept, his dreams tangled with flashes of Amara's face, her trembling voice, and the haunting words she'd left him with. The address she'd given still lingered in his phone, and despite his usual routine of coffee and the morning news, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. By mid-morning, the pull became too strong to ignore. He grabbed his jacket and keys, heading back to the address she'd given him. It was an old building with peeling paint and windows that hadn't seen a good cleaning in years. It had the kind of quiet that made you feel like the walls themselves were holding secrets. Mike lingered outside, unsure of what he was doing. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she wasn't even there? But before he could turn back, the door creaked open, and an older woman stepped out, holding a basket of laundry. She gave him a curious look, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. "I'm looking for someone," Mike said, clearing his throat. "A young woman named Amara. She might live here?" The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "She does. Top floor, third door on the left," but she hesitated, lowering her voice. "If you're here to bring her trouble, I'd think twice. That girl's been through enough." Her words sent a jolt through Mike, but he managed a polite nod. "I'm not here to hurt her. I just need to talk to her." The woman gave him one last wary glance before stepping aside. Mike climbed the narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing in the silence. His heart pounded with each step, and by the time he reached the top floor, his palms were damp with sweat. He stood in front of the third door, hesitating. What was he even going to say? Before he could decide, the door opened. Amara stood there, her cane in hand, her head tilted slightly as if she'd been expecting him. "Mike," she said softly, her voice a mix of surprise and something else. Relief, maybe. "You came." Yeah," he stammered. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said last night." She stepped back, gesturing for him to come in. The apartment was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and walls lined with bookshelves. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and a soft hum of music played from an old radio in the corner. Amara motioned for him to sit, and they settled across from each other in the tiny living room. She folded her hands tightly in her lap, her expression guarded but open enough to show she wasn't entirely surprised by his arrival. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember," she said quietly. "Remember what?" Mike asked, leaning forward. "Amara, I've been trying to figure out what you meant, what connection we have, but I don't know." Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she let out a long breath. "It's not an easy story to tell," she admitted, "but if I don't tell you now, I'm afraid I never will." Mike's chest tightened. "Then tell me," he urged. "Please. I need to know." She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her cane. "Years ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was in a dark place. I made a lot of bad choices that hurt people, including myself. One night, I got myself into something I couldn't get out of. I thought it was the end." Her voice cracked and she paused, composing herself. Mike didn't dare interrupt. He could see the struggle in her expression, the weight of whatever she was holding on to. "And then," she continued, her eyes meeting his, "you showed up. You didn't know me, but you helped me anyway. You got me out of that situation, and because of you, I had the chance to start over. But I never got to thank you, and I never told you the truth." Mike's mind raced, the memory of that rainy night coming into sharper focus. "Amara," he said slowly, "are you saying you were that girl? The one I picked up in the storm?" She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never forgot that night, and I never forgot what I did to deserve being in that situation. I've spent years trying to make up for it, trying to become someone worth saving. Her words hit Mike like a punch to the gut. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. "What happened, Amara?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why do you think you need my forgiveness?" She looked away, her hands trembling. "Because," she whispered, "what I did that night wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal. And I've been carrying it ever since." Mike's breath caught in his throat. Whatever she was about to reveal, he knew it would be the answer he'd been searching for. And the beginning of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Amara's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged. Mike sat frozen, the small apartment around him fading into the background as he tried to process what she had just said. A betrayal? The word echoed in his mind, sharp and stinging. He wanted to press her, to demand answers, but the look on her face stopped him. She was unraveling right in front of him, and it was clear that whatever she was about to share wasn't easy. "Amara," he said gently, leaning forward, "you can tell me. Whatever it is, I'm here." Her hands gripped her cane so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if the words were too big to push out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "That night," she began, her voice trembling, "I wasn't just running away. I wasn't some innocent girl caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. I did something, Mike. Something I can never take back." Mike's stomach churned. He could see the pain etched into her features, the way her whole body seemed to fold in on itself. Whatever she was about to say, he knew it was going to change everything. "I was with someone," she continued, her words halting. "A man. He wasn't a good person. I thought I could handle it, thought I could get what I needed and walk away. But things went wrong, so wrong. He found out I'd betrayed him, taken something I wasn't supposed to." Her voice broke, and she wiped at her face, tears streaming down. "He came after me. That's why I was running. That's why I got in your cab." Mike's grip on his knees tightened as the memory came rushing back. The rain, the fear in her voice, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder. He had known something was wrong, but he hadn't asked questions. He'd just driven, taking her where she needed to go. "He wasn't going to let me get away," she said, her voice barely audible now. "And when I left, I didn't just leave him. I left something else behind." Mike frowned, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice rough. Amara's lips trembled as she struggled to speak. "I left someone else in danger," she admitted, her words like a knife cutting through the air. "Someone who didn't deserve it. And I've been carrying that guilt ever since." The room seemed to close in around Mike. He could barely breathe, his mind racing to fill in the gaps of her story. "Who?" he asked, his voice sharp now. "Amara, who did you leave behind?" She looked at him, her eyes glassy with tears. "A girl," she said, her voice cracking. "She was just a kid. She got caught in the middle, and I didn't go back for her." Mike felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. A kid? His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of it all. The image of that rainy night burned in his memory, sharper now, more vivid. Had there been someone else? Someone he hadn't seen? "I didn't know what to do," Amara continued, her voice trembling. "I was scared, Mike. I thought if I stayed, we'd both die. So I ran. And then you were there, and I thought maybe I could fix it. Maybe I could get away and make it right. But I never did. I never went back." Mike's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of her confession pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but he also wanted to reach out, to tell her it was okay, even though he wasn't sure it was. "You left her," he said finally, his voice low and heavy. "And you think I saved you?" She nodded, her face crumpling. "I've been trying to live with that ever since," she said, "trying to figure out if I even deserve to be saved." Mike leaned back, his mind a storm of emotions. The betrayal she'd spoken of wasn't just about the man she'd run from. It was about the child she'd left behind. And now, all these years later, it had come crashing into his life like a tidal wave. But the questions wouldn't stop. Who was the girl? What happened? What happened to her? And why had fate brought Amara back into his life now, after all this time? As the silence stretched between them, Mike knew one thing for certain. They couldn't leave it here. Whatever had happened that night, whatever truth was still buried, It was time to dig it up. Together. Mike stared at Amara, the weight of her confession still pressing heavily on his chest. The room felt stifling, each second dragging out longer than the last. His mind was a whirl of questions and emotions he couldn't quite untangle. He knew he had to say something, to push for more clarity. But the look on Amara's face, equal parts guilt and fear, held him back. "Amara," he began, his voice softer now, though it trembled with restrained frustration, "you're telling me you left a child behind. A child! Do you even know what happened to her?" She shook her head, her fingers fidgeting with the fraying hem of her sweater. "I tried to find out," she whispered. "For years, I searched, but it's like she vanished. No reports, no records, nothing." Her voice broke. "I thought about going to the police, but how could I explain my part in all of it? I was terrified they'd blame me, and maybe they should have." Mike leaned forward, the intensity in his eyes making Amara flinch. "You should have done something sooner," he said, his tone more biting than he intended. "This isn't something you just move on from." "I didn't move on," she snapped, surprising them both with her sudden outburst. Tears streaked her face as she looked at him with raw desperation. "You think I don't live with this every single day? That I don't hear her voice in my head, see her face in every little girl I pass on the street?" Her voice cracked as she buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. Mike's anger softened, replaced by a pang of guilt. He rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling deeply. "I'm sorry," he muttered. This is a lot to take in." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the radio in the corner. Then, just as Mike opened his mouth to ask another question, Amara's phone buzzed on the table between them. She glanced at it, her brows furrowing in confusion. "It's a number I don't recognize," she said, almost to herself. Mike watched as she hesitated, then swiped to answer. "Hello?" she said cautiously. Whatever she heard on the other end made her freeze. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. "What? No, that's not possible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike leaned closer, his instincts kicking in. "What is it?" he asked, but she held up a shaky hand to silence him. The call ended abruptly, and Amara sat there staring at her phone like it was a ghost. "Amara," Mike pressed, his voice firm but steady. "What's going on?" She looked up at him, her face pale and stricken. It was someone who knew her, the girl. Her voice was trembling, her words rushed. "They said she's alive, Mike. She's alive, and she's been looking for me." Mike felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "What? How?" "They wouldn't say much," Amara interrupted, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "Just that she's been trying to track me down for years, and that she wants to meet." Mike's head spun as the revelation sank in. A part of him wanted to believe it was some kind of cruel joke, but the look on Amara's face told him it wasn't. If this was true, if the girl had survived, it changed everything. But then another thought struck him, one that made his stomach turn. "Amara," he said slowly, his voice edged with caution. Did they say how she found you?" Amara frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "No? Why?" Mike's gut tightened. "Because if she's been looking for you all this time, and she suddenly knows where to find you, that means someone else does too." The realization hit them both like a thunderclap. Amara's eyes darted to the windows, her body tensing as though expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. "You think," she began, her voice barely audible. "I think," Mike said grimly, "that this isn't over. Not even close." The stakes had just risen, and the sense of impending danger was impossible to ignore. Whatever was coming for them, Mike knew they'd have to face it together. And this time, there would be no turning back. The room felt charged, every shadow and creak of the old apartment suddenly sharper, more threatening. Mike's words hung in the air, and Amara's breathing grew shallow as she clutched her cane like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the weight of his warning settling between them. The knock on the door shattered the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a jolt through both of them. Amara's head snapped toward the sound, her grip on the cane tightening. Mike instinctively moved toward her, putting himself between her and the door. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low and firm. She nodded, her face pale but determined. Mike approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A young woman stood on the other side, her face partially obscured by a hoodie. She looked nervous, shifting her weight from one foot to the other and glancing down the hallway. "Who is it?" Amara asked from behind him, her voice trembling. Mike hesitated, then said, "I think it might be her." He opened the door slowly, keeping his body tense, ready for anything. The young woman looked up, her eyes wide and filled with an emotion Mike couldn't quite place. "Amara?" she asked, her voice soft but trembling. Amara stepped forward, her cane tapping softly against the floor. "I'm here," she said, her voice cracking with a mix of fear and hope. "Are you?" "I'm Leah," the girl said quickly, pulling back her hood to reveal striking features that somehow felt familiar. "I've been looking for you." Amara's breath hitched and her knees nearly buckled. "Leah, oh my God, you're alive." Her words came out in a whisper, filled with disbelief and overwhelming relief. Leah stepped inside, her gaze darting nervously to Mike before settling on Amara. "I am?" she said, her voice hardening slightly. "But it hasn't been easy. I've been waiting for this moment to finally see you again, to ask you, why did you leave me?" The question cut through the room like a knife. Amara's shoulders slumped and tears filled her eyes. I thought I was saving you," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought if I stayed, he would hurt us both. I didn't know what else to do." Leah's face twisted with a mix of anger and sadness. "Do you know what it was like, being left behind?" she demanded. "I thought you'd come back. I waited for you, but you never did." "I'm so sorry," Amara choked out, reaching for her. "I've carried that guilt every day. I tried to find you." "But you didn't," Leah interrupted, pulling back. "You moved on, and I had to survive on my own." Mike watched the exchange, his chest tightening. He could see both sides, the guilt and the pain, the anger and the longing. But something about Leah's demeanor made his instincts flare. "Leah," he said cautiously, stepping forward, "how did you find Amara? Who told you where to look?" Leah's expression faltered, her gaze flicking toward the door. "It doesn't matter," she said quickly. "What matters is that I'm here now." "It does matter," Mike pressed, his tone sharper. "Because if someone else knows, then we might not be safe." Leah hesitated, her hands clenching into fists. I didn't come alone," she admitted, her voice dropping. Amara froze. "What do you mean?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Before Leah could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Mike's heart sank as he turned toward the door. "We need to move," he said urgently. But it was too late. The door burst open and a man stepped inside, his presence dominating the small space. He was older, with a cold, calculating look in his eyes that made Mike's stomach churn. "Well, isn't this a touching reunion?" the man drawled, his voice dripping with menace. Leah shrank back, her tough exterior crumbling in an instant. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered to Amara, her voice filled with regret. "He made me bring him here." Mike moved in front of both women, his fists clenched. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The man smirked. "Let's just say I'm someone who doesn't like loose ends. And Amara here has been one for far too long." Amara's breath hitched, and she clung to Leah, who looked on the verge of tears. "I'm sorry," Leah whispered again, her voice breaking. Mike's mind raced, searching for a way out. The tension in the room was suffocating, every second feeling like an eternity. And then, almost as if on instinct, he grabbed the old lamp from the side table and swung it with all his strength. The man staggered back, momentarily stunned. "Run!" Mike shouted, grabbing Amara's arm and pulling her toward the door. Leah hesitated for a split second, then followed, her face a mix of fear and determination. Together, they bolted down the stairs, the sound of the man's enraged shouts echoing behind them. When they reached the street, Mike flagged down a passing car, the urgency in his voice convincing the driver to help. As they sped away, Amara clung to Leah, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered over and over. Leah finally looked at her, her eyes softening. "I wanted answers," she said quietly. "But I didn't want this." Mike glanced back at them, his heart pounding. They were safe for now, but he knew this wasn't over. The past had caught up with them, and the fight to keep it from destroying their future had only just begun. The car sped through the streets, the tension inside thick and suffocating. Mike kept glancing behind them, his grip tightening on the seat as he tried to stay alert. Amara clung to Leah, her hands trembling but steady enough to remind the girl she wasn't alone anymore. "I didn't want to bring him," Leah whispered, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "He found me a few weeks ago, said he'd been looking for Amara. I didn't know what else to do." "It's not your fault," Amara said softly, brushing a tear from Leah's cheek. "You've been through so much. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you when you needed me most." Leah nodded, but her expression was conflicted. "I wanted to hate you," she admitted. "But now, I don't know. I just wanted answers. And now, after everything, I think I just wanted to see you again." Mike glanced back at them, his heart aching at the raw emotion between them. He knew their reunion was complicated, layered with pain and regret, but there was something powerful in their connection. As the car weaved through the city, Mike instructed the driver to head to a safe spot, a friend's garage on the outskirts of town where they could regroup and figure out their next move. The driver, sensing the urgency, nodded and kept quiet. When they arrived, Mike helped them out of the car and led them into the dimly lit space. It smelled faintly of oil and rubber, the familiar scent grounding him for a moment as he locked the door behind them. "We're safe for now," he said, leaning against the door. "But we need to figure out what's next." Amara looked at Leah, her eyes soft but filled with determination. "Leah, I know I can't undo what happened, but I need to know, what does he want? Why was he after you? After me?" Leah hesitated, then sighed. "It's not just about you running," she said. "You took something from him, something he said was worth everything. I didn't understand it at first, but I think it was evidence, something that could ruin him." Amara's breath caught. Memories flooded back, chaotic, fragmented images of the night she fled. She remembered grabbing a small, unassuming envelope from his desk, thinking it was cash or something she could use to escape. She hadn't looked inside, too scared and desperate to think beyond getting away. "That envelope," Amara murmured. "I didn't even realize." Mike straightened. "Do you still have it?" Amara nodded slowly. "It's in storage. I've kept it all these years, afraid to even open it." Leah's eyes widened. "If it's what I think it is, that could end this. We could use it against him." Mike's jaw tightened. "That's a dangerous move, but it might be the only way to keep him off your back for good." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Then, with a deep breath, Amara nodded. "It's time to finish this." Over the next few days, they worked together to retrieve the envelope and uncover its contents. Inside were documents and photos, clear evidence of illegal activities that could destroy the man who had hunted them. With Mike's help, they carefully turned the evidence over to the authorities, ensuring it would lead to an investigation while keeping their involvement anonymous. As the news broke and the man's empire began to crumble, Amara, Leah, and Mike finally felt a sense of relief. The danger was over, and the weight of the past began to lift. In the days that followed, Amara and Leah worked to rebuild their relationship, piecing together the years they had lost. Leah opened up about her struggles, and Amara shared her regret and determination to make things right moving forward. One evening, as they sat together in a quiet park, Leah turned to Amara and smiled, a small tentative smile that spoke volumes. "You didn't come back for me then," she said, her voice soft. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." Amara reached for her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'll never leave you again," she promised. Mike watched from a distance, his heart full as he saw the bond between them grow stronger. He knew their journey hadn't been easy, but seeing them together now gave him hope. Sometimes, the past had a way of catching up, but in facing it head-on, they had found something more powerful: forgiveness, healing, and a chance to start over. And in that, they had found a way forward, together.